I'm Karen Cox, author of Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Stranger Than Fiction, the nonfiction program on Author's Voice, a virtual book signing network. Author's Voice is called a virtual book signing network because you are here with us right now. You're watching this program live, and therefore there's a couple of things I would like to fill you in on, you folks at home. Although it's you folks at home, you folks on your computer, you folks on your iPad, you folks on your phone. We had a question once from someone on the train. They were coming home and you can do that. You can watch this on any device that you want. Author's Voice is a virtual book signing network. Now, what you can see right now in front of you is your viewer. And what your viewer will permit you to do is ask a question. There's a big button there. Hit that. Ask a question. When you ask a question, that's an instant messenger. So ask the question, type it in, then type in your name and where you're from, because we want to say hello to you when you send in a question. So do that while we're together here live. Ask a question. Also, another thing you can do that makes this a real authentic seeming book signing, you could purchase the book. That's why the publishers send the authors here. That's why they're able to send the authors here, and you want to support reading, you want to support literature, and you want to build a fine, signed, first edition library. That's what we can help you do with Author's Voice. Like I said, welcome to Stranger Than Fiction. I am your host, Bjorn Skaptason. And for the next 30 minutes or more, if we're having a good time, we will be discussing a fascinating book from a fascinating author. And so send us your questions or just enjoy the talk. Order the book. We will ship it out to you, signed and in first edition. What is today's book? Let me show you. Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South. It is published by University of North Carolina Press. 227 pages and costs you $26. The author is with us right here today, Karen L. Cox. Karen is a professor of history at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She's the author of Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, and of course, the author now of Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South. Welcome, Karen.
I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you for coming to Chicago, and thank you for being on Stranger Than Fiction.
I'm really happy to be here.
Now, I want you to tell us a little bit about Goat Castle, but the way I want to frame this is Goat Castle was famous. It was very famous. You have all heard of the Goat Castle, or you haven't. Tell us about the Goat Castle, and how did this very famous thing become a book of yours?
Well, Goat Castle is just a reference to an old crumbling down antebellum mansion in Natchez, Mississippi, that became the center of a media storm following the murder of a woman that lived next door, actually. But given the conditions of the house and the fact that the people who lived there also kept a pen of goats in their house, they began calling it Goat Castle. So castle being sort of like an antebellum mansion might have been thought of, and then the fact that goats were also living there as well.
Goats and chickens and birds and any other
Exactly.
kind of yard animal that can
Exactly.
come through the open door. Now, in your subtitle, you call this a story of the Gothic South.
Right.
What do we mean by the Gothic South?
The Gothic South, at least in this context, is a reference to the social decline, the mental decline, economic decline of the Old South. And so what we have here is a situation where elite Southerners have fallen on hard times, are living in Goat Castle, completely the opposite of the families that they had descended from. And so there are lots of references to Gothic literature when this story comes out. A reference to, initially, to Edgar Allan Poe and The Fall of the House of Usher. And then later to Faulkner's novels, and particularly a story, A Rose for Emily. So there's this Gothic nature of this crumbling down civilization that in some ways is being represented by Goat Castle and the people who inhabit it.
So the people around the country, newspaper readers around the country,
Right.
they love reading Poe, they love reading Faulkner, they love the
Right.
myths of the Old South, and suddenly in the newspaper, there it is. It's happening right in front of it.
Exactly. It's come to life, and it's not fiction, and that is what's fascinating to people.
Now, Goat Castle it is a murder. So can you fill us in on the details, or at least the basics of the murder case that
Right.
we're talking about?
Well, the basics is that the woman who lived next door to the people living in Goat Castle, her name was Jenny Merrill. She was descendant of the planter aristocracy of Natchez, Mississippi, and she was murdered in her home during a botched robbery. That's essentially what it was about. But because she had a long-running feud with the neighbors who live with their goats, and because of their trespassing goats and hogs and etc., the thought was within the community, at least among the sheriff and his deputies, that they may have had something to do with it. And so the murder takes place on the evening of August 4th, 1932, in in the depths of the Depression. And the first people arrested are the couple that live in Goat Castle, a man named Dick Dana, and the woman who lived with him, and they were not married. Her name was Octavia Dockery. She was his guardian because he had been declared non compos mentis many years before. And so they are the first to be arrested. And as the story begins to unravel about where they live and what the conditions in which they live and their own stories of decline, the media focus becomes completely about them, even as the investigation into the murder is ongoing.
And this caused some problems for the law enforcement officials, did it not? The sheriff and the DA, with the public focusing on these two people,
Exactly.
rather than assisting in the way they can with the investigation.
Right. He was overwhelmed because of the national media attention. I mean, within 2 days it was a headline in the New York Times, and in the weeks and the days and weeks that followed, it was in every newspaper, large and small, across the country. And so he had journalists showing up at the sheriff's office, and they were getting in the way of the investigation. And so yeah, it did cause problems for him. But he continued to do that. But he had to call in. He ended up calling in an expert from New Orleans to assist him with the investigation. But he clearly was overwhelmed, and he felt like these journalists and the media was getting in the way of his proceeding with his investigation. Although he did go ahead, and of course that attention on his primary suspects, at least in that first couple of weeks once following the murder, because they were in jail in the Adams County Jail. That was also problematic because not only was he getting questions from the press, but people from the community were wanting to come and visit, and journalists wanted to interview Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery about their lives. And so it got to the point where he said he kept them separated and kept them incommunicado so that they couldn't be talking to the press. And so, yes, it got out of hand pretty quickly.
It's a media circus.
Yes.
Now, all of this happens. There's one more character I think I want to, well, there's many more characters.
Right, there's a lot.
A lot of characters. But I think there's one very fascinating character that I want to bring into discussion right now, and that is the character of this town, the
Yes.
character of Natchez.
Yeah.
Because Goat Castle and all these curious characters may not have been able to exist outside of the context.
Right.
Tell us about Natchez, Mississippi. What is Natchez, Mississippi to us?
Right. Natchez is fascinating. It is just recently celebrated its 300th anniversary. It's a small town that sits on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. But in the decades before the Civil War, it was one of the wealthiest towns per capita in the United States. And that had to do with cotton and slaves. So a lot of Northerners had come down to Natchez, invested in land and cotton, and were instrumental in the domestic slave trade that brought anywhere between 3/4 to 1 million people, enslaved people, from the Upper South to the Deep South to work for these men and earn them their wealth. And in the city of Natchez, therefore, they built these grand homes. They're the kind of homes that people might associate with what you saw in Gone with the Wind. They were fantastic in antebellum architecture. And so that alone was already something that had put Natchez on the map, because a few months before this murder, people had started to come to Natchez. They started what they called the Natchez Pilgrimage. And so there were tourists coming from the Northeast and the Midwest just to see this antebellum grandeur. And Goat Castle represented the complete opposite of that. Jenny Merrill's association, the woman who was murdered, was descended from one of the wealthiest planters in the entire South before the Civil War. Her grandfather owned plantations in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He was a millionaire many times over. And her father was a very successful planter, and who went on to become Grant's ambassador to Belgium in 1876. So she had this lineage. So there was that lineage regarding with Natchez as itself, and then this Goat Castle stuff that gives you the complete opposite image of Natchez. But Natchez continues to this day to attract tourists to this antebellum history, this idealized Old South that it represents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just as a shout out to Natchez and all the great things they do with their local history,
right.
It really is, it's not just a mythic of the Southern South. If you go in 2017, they don't just give you the myth, they have some really great history. The National Park Service has a fine thing, and they look at the history of the slave trade and the history of slavery there, as well as the grand mansions and so on.
Right, exactly. So the National Park Service encompasses not only plantations, but the barber of Natchez, the free black man who was who'd written about Natchez, and so they preserved his site. So you have you can tour a site of a free black man who lived in Natchez, as well as they've also started to do a little bit more around walking tours of even the black business district along St. Catherine Street. The one thing that they haven't gotten to, there's a small little plot of land, the forks of the road, where they've tried to, local groups have tried to interpret that history as well. So there's a lot going on in this very small town, which hasn't really grown much even since this crime took place. The town is maybe 15,000, 16,000 people even today. And during the Civil War, that period, there was only about 4,000 people living there, 4,000 white people living there. I should be clear about that, because there were thousands more were enslaved.
Now, you brought up the forks of the road, and that's going to bring us back to part of our story here, part of the Goat Castle story. But before we get to the black community, the African American community, tell us about the importance of forks in the road.
Yeah.
What does that mean to Natchezians?
Yeah.
Was that even right?
Natchezian.
Natchezians? I don't know.
But the Forks of the Road is a place that was the site of the slave trade in Natchez. Natchez had the second largest slave trading post outside of New Orleans in the Deep South. Of course, there are larger ones in Charleston and Savannah, but in the Deep South, Natchez had the second largest slave trading post, and it was situated at the Forks of the Road, and it kind of led either from down the Natchez Trace, for example, was one of the routes into the Forks, where coffles of slaves had been marched from Virginia, Maryland, all the way over to Nashville, and then all the way down the Natchez Trace for sale at the Forks of the Road. And a second route into Natchez was upriver from New Orleans, where slaves would be that had been shipped from places like Baltimore and came through the port of New Orleans would then be placed onto steamboats, essentially, and then taken upriver to Natchez, where they would be sold to the planters of Natchez for their not only in their county of Adams County and Jefferson County, but the large majority of them were working on cotton plantations across the Mississippi River in Concordia Parish.
Mm-hmm. So that gives us the idea of that Forks in the Road, but also when we get to our story, when we get to Goat Castle, this same area is an important part of the still an important part of the African-American community in Natchez. It's still right. African-American people still live there,
right.
And a couple of very unfortunate
yes.
people that become accomplices
right.
in this murder
right.
come from that neighborhood. Can you
right.
fill us in on Pink Williams and Emily Burns?
Yeah, well, what happened was when the Civil War ended and the free black population kind of built neighborhoods around the former slave trading posts, and then by the 20th century, there were rental homes were built there by white landlords within the Natchez community, and so this is where Emily Burns was living in 1932, along with her mother. Both she and her mother were widows by 1932 when this crime occurred, and they were maintaining a rooming house. And so this fellow comes in from Chicago in the summer of 1932, and asks and rents a room from them, and so he was in a separate rooming house in the neighborhood, but I think he may have taken a shine to Emily Burns and moved into and rented a room with her. His name in Chicago was George Pearls, but he was born in Natchez or in Adams County under the name of Lawrence Williams, but he gave his name to Emily Burns as Pinckney Williams, and she called him Pink.
Okay.
So that gets confusing, but he was going by an alias. But he was known under the name Williams in Natchez, regardless of the first name.
But he's certainly one of these traveling men from Chicago,
right?
Who comes down, and he has his own story looking for work.
Right.
But he comes down looking for work, and Natchez is not the kind of place apparently that he had been looking for, or at least the treatment.
Right.
The treatment he got from
right.
the people there.
Right. Well, he came to town because this is where he had grown up before he migrated to Chicago, and felt, well, in the middle of the Depression when he had lost his job with the Argo refinery, he would go back to where he had family and there was familiar work, and he had a difficult time finding work. He went from house to house, plantation to plantation, and got turned down. And then he'd gone to Jenny Merrill's home, was one of his last stops before this crime took place, and she offered him food but nothing in the way of work. So he walks over next door to her neighbors, Goat Castle, what will become known as Goat Castle. It was known as Glenwood. It was the name of that estate. met Dick Dana and Octavia Dockery, and it's there that the plan was hatched that maybe they should, if they wanted some money, because they were impoverished, he needed money. So, and Octavia Dockery kind of understood the comings and goings of Jenny Merrill's cousin, who would come every evening to spend the night with her. And so they plotted to rob her. But I think Dockery knew that if anything came up, even if the sheriff suspected them, that it was very likely in the Jim Crow South that the black man would be the one who would be implicated.
Mm-hmm. Now we'll let the people who buy the book get a chance to actually read your fine narrative of how the murder plays out. But one of the things that you notice in this that I think is so fascinating, sometimes you notice it directly, sometimes you just kind of weave it into the narrative, is that the white people are constantly referring to African American people who are apparently, clearly ubiquitous. They're everywhere all the time. There are people living in squatter shacks on Glenwood property and all the way around. There have to be dozens of witnesses to all of this going on. But in 1932, in Natchez, not only do they not seem to matter to law enforcement, the white people don't even seem to see them around them. Am I perceiving that right?
See who around them?
The African American people that are living immediately around them. One thing that I noticed is that the Dockery and Dana mentioned that when they heard something going on, they thought it must have been neighbors having some sort of domestic dispute.
They referred to a Negro man beating his wife or something like that. Yeah, they seem to be rather anonymous in some ways, like they might not know them by name. They just know them as Negroes who work in the surrounding plantations.
Yeah, and we don't think of Natchez at the time, as you alluded to before, as being a majority African American.
But it was,
city.
yeah.
It was much a majority African American city during slavery.
Right, and even in the era of Jim Crow, and by this time, about 55% of the population of Natchez was African American in 1932. So that was significant. They were a majority, and yet second-class citizens, because this is the way things operated in Jim Crow Mississippi, which is why so many of them had migrated away from states like Mississippi to Chicago, to Detroit, as a way to escape what they would call the Southern way of life, which is basically white supremacy, white control over the black population. And so they looked with suspicion on people like George Pearls, a.k.a. Lawrence Williams, because he had migrated away from the South. Those African Americans who migrated out of the South and then who came back to visit family were dealt with as suspiciously. Why would they leave here? Local whites were perplexed by that, but it was real obvious why they would leave there. And then that they had left, and then if they were even visiting, then it was not only that they had left, but that now they were these city Negroes now. They had forgotten their place in Southern society, and so that also made them suspicious. Just that they had gotten cityfied somehow.
Yeah. Well, yeah. George Pearls, Pink Williams, was born in Natchez, went to Chicago, came back. The same story repeats itself in the 1950s when Emmett Till, his family goes to Chicago. He's born, he comes back, a local who came back and then got in trouble by bringing city ways. Exactly. It's a different story.
Right, it's a different story, but I mean that theme it still resonates at that point. With these returning these Southern blacks who had migrated to Chicago and other northern cities, and then returning home has somehow changed them. in a way, because they have rejected the Southern way of life. And so that alone makes them suspicious characters in the minds of Southern whites, which is why, they once it's learned that there had been this, and they called him a strange Negro. And he was, because he wasn't familiar to them. But he was familiar to the black community because he grew up there. He had just gone away. So anyone who was just sort of had not stayed in the community and gone away, and even the people who he had worked for, Duncan Minor, Jenny's cousin, said he didn't recognize him. He said, "Oh, we've had many of them come and go over the years." He doesn't even think of them as human, or he has no name for them, names for these people. They're just people who come and go and do work for him.
The quote you put in the book that really grabbed me was that Duncan Minor said, "Oh, I've fired so many of those, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't recognize. I fired so many
right.
of these people that I don't recognize them."
Yeah.
He doesn't imagine what that
yeah.
means, what he's saying.
Exactly.
But we do need to, we're using up our time fast, but we do need to bring Emily. We need to bring Sister into this story, because we've found her there at the forks of the road, and somehow she ends up being the person that really suffers the most misfortune as a result of this crime.
Right.
Of course.
Aside from Jenny Merrill, who was
Merrill.
murdered.
I suppose. So, with all due respect to the victim of the crime.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he brings her along on his walk to go and to rob Jenny Merrill, and she recognizes that this is not some place she wants to be or wants to be a part of, and he threatens to kill her if she tries to leave or says anything. So she's frightened, and she's stuck, and she could die at the hands of Pink, who she thought cared for her, or she's going to get it from the local law enforcement, which is eventually what happens. And so she doesn't go into the house. She acts as a watch while they go in to rob her, and then everything goes haywire, and and then she heads back home, and he skedaddles out of town really quickly, but leaves his trunk of belongings back at her home as he tries to make his way back to Chicago. And in a completely unrelated incident, he gets shot and killed in Arkansas for being one of these strange Negroes in an Arkansas town that they didn't recognize. And so eventually people begin to tip off the sheriff as they're doing the investigation that this man had been staying with Emily Burns, and when they go to talk to her, they discover his trunk at her home, and she's immediately arrested along with her mother, and they're taken to the Adams County Jail, and that's where her incarceration begins, and she's never released. Jim Crow didn't give her justice. She remains in a jail cell in the Adams County Sheriff's Office for 4 months without an attorney. She doesn't get an attorney until she's indicted for murder, and her trial is only 1 week after that indictment. So within a really short span of time, she is tried, convicted, and given a life sentence to the Mississippi State Penitentiary for something she didn't do, and just having been caught at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then she ends up. You'll have to read the book to get the whole story of this, but she just has this really terrible experience in this really terrible Mississippi prison, and you do a great job of describing that part of the story as well. But that sort of brings us to to your experience writing the book, because you spent so much time in Natchez. And how did the city, how did the stuff that's there, the archives, and also how did the people who are still related to the principals in this story, first of all, are they there? And then did you interact with them, and did you get information from them?
Well, let's talk about Natchez, I guess, first, the first
Yeah.
part of that question, which is there is a lot of material there in Natchez. It took some digging. Sometimes I was in some really uncomfortable places because the one thing that I needed to find, I was looking for court records, the trial record, for example, just to get some idea of how things shook out. And I was told that these records were in an abandoned pie factory in the old freezer where they kept the pie crusts. And so I go into this place and I've got gloves on and a headlamp because it's really dark in there, and I have a mask on my face, and it's like searching for a needle in a haystack. But I struck gold right off the bat, and it wasn't that there was a trial transcript, because I never found that, because they wouldn't do cases like that unless there was a chance that it was going to be appealed. They just didn't do that. But what I found was the witness docket, and the witness docket gave me the case number. And from that case number, I was able to go, because things are in separate places. You have a number here, but the file is in a completely different location. And so that case number was really, really key to my being able to find the details of the case, there in Natchez. There were records at LSU Special Collections that were very, very valuable to me. I did oral histories with locals, including this man named Duncan Morgan, who was octogenarian from the African American community. And I was so desperate to find details about Emily Burns, who had spent time in prison, because the story is told in Natchez, it never really includes her. And so I remember sitting down with him and I said, I know she was released from prison. Her sentence was suspended at a certain time. Whatever happened to Emily Burns? And he said, without missing a beat, "Oh, Miss Burns, she lived across the street from me. And she married Mr. Lee Randolph." And it was just that little bit of information. And he told me a little bit about knowing her as a young boy, growing up in Natchez. And he eventually would connect me to a member of her church. And the way it came about was this: you just have to, if you're a historian, you have to follow every lead. And so he left the names of 2 women and a phone number at the Historic Natchez Foundation. And I go in, they say, "Well, Duncan left this for you, and it's all it has. I don't know what it's, but I know to call that number." Yeah. And so when I call the number, I end up meeting a woman named Doris Maynard and her mother, Daisy Green. And Doris was 65, her mother was 89. And her mother was a contemporary of Emily Burns, and they were members of the church that she went to. And it was the first time I ever heard the name sister. Emily Burns is the name that's put into the paper, but the way people know her and knew her family and friends called her sister, and that just personalized her. And it was very, very important for me. And I eventually go to visit the church, where I met second cousins. And because here's the thing, all of the principals, none of them had children. None of them. Jenny Merrill had never married. Neither, obviously, the Goat Castle couple weren't really a couple, other than they shared the same space with some goats. But I had to go to that church, and it was going to that church where I met extended family members who knew exactly who I was talking about, shared with me the only photograph that exists of Emily Burns, which is on the cover of the book, but I would never have found it if it hadn't started from that first interview with Duncan, who introduced me to the women at the church, who said, "Come visit our church, you'll meet some of her family members."
Right.
And it was you just have to follow all these clues and pieces of the puzzle to recreate the story. And it was recovering her story was an essential part of this book.
Yes, and that's really, have been other books about the Goat Castle murder, but what's unique about this one, as you said before, brings Emily into it. But that couldn't have been done without
Right.
going to Natchez and meeting people and
Yeah.
talking to them. And Natchez does, as we've said many times before, it's a major character in this book. And it has produced, it's been a wellspring of topics, very interesting topics for a lot of historians in the fairly recent past. One of them was, I wrote these down here, Death of an Overseer by Michael Wayne in 2001, where he took a court case of a murder of an overseer during the antebellum period and stretched that out into a full-length book and taught us about the times and places of Natchez. Probably more important was Winthrop Jordan's excellent book, 1993, Tumult and Silence at Second Creek. And here's where Jordan had simply found a reference in the newspaper, as I remember this, to shortly after the beginning of the Civil War, the Natchez slave owners took 50 slaves and hanged them as an example. And then that disappeared. And so Jordan jumped into the topic. He jumped into Natchez. He jumped into the community, and he discovered this thing. So I think Goat Castle rests within a fine body of literature, a lot of which has done the same sorts of detective work that you've done so well with this book. And congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, I think I've made my way through most of the questions, but there is one question I want you to think about while I get ready to wrap up the show.
Okay.
And the question is this: when the movie gets made, and I have Tim Burton directing.
Oh yeah.
When it gets made, when the movie gets made, which role do you wish to play, Karen?
I want to play this woman named Zeta Wells. I'm actually around her age at the time that this crime had taken place. And I describe her as the Gladys Kravitz of Natchez. She was very interested. She saw all the movement and the running back and forth at the sheriff's office. She drove her car out that evening to see what was going on at the crime scene. And she attended the court case, the trial of Emily Burns.
How did you find her stories? Did she write them down? Did she have a diary?
She wrote a little booklet called the Merrill Murder Mystery, because it's like 17 pages, but that's the way it was known. It was known locally initially as the Merrill murder because that's who was killed, and then over time that the press turned it into the story of Goat Castle, which is why I wanted to research this. I knew I was fascinated by this idea of this quirky couple that lived with their goats, but it was bigger than that and more. There's that story definitely, but there's also a more poignant story around Emily Burns, the injustice that she endured.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. And I want to take a few minutes to tell the folks at home what is coming up on Author's Voice in a couple of our programs. The next thing that's going to be on Author's Voice will be a debut. Will be the debut of a brand new show called Berta's Books. Berta's Books. You're going to love this show because it features, as the host, the doyenne of all Chicago booksellers, Roberta Rubin. And Roberta is going to kick off her new show with her guest will be Roz Chaz, the cartoonist from the Atlantic. I think it's the Atlantic, but Roz Chaz will be here with Going to Town, her new book of Graphica, and it's going to be really great. So do not miss Berta's Books, debuting on October 10th. On October 14th, we come back to we come back to our Civil War program, House Divided. John Marcellak will be here from the U.S. Grant Presidential Library. He'll be signing copies of the newly edited version of Grant's memoirs. And with him will be Charles Calhoun with The Presidency of U.S. Grant, a fascinating new book about this presidency, this controversial presidency of U.S. Grant. On October 20th, Brian Dirk will be here. He'll be coming up from Indiana to talk about Lincoln in Indiana, along with Guy Fraker, with Looking for Lincoln in Illinois. That will also be A House Divided. Again, on A House Divided, we love our Civil War books. We love our Lincoln and Civil War books. On October 27, Michael Hogan will be here. Dr. Michael Hogan will come up from Mexico, and we will be talking about his fascinating new book, Abraham Lincoln and Mexico. You're not going to want to miss that. That's a new book. That's unplowed ground. We're really going to want to see that. Finally, on November 1st, and by no means is this finally, we have programs booked right through Christmas time at this point. On November 1st, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, biographer Ron Chernow will return to Author's Voice and to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop to discuss and sign his new biography of U.S. Grant called Grant. And I can announce right now, because we've just made this agreement today, on the same day, in the same program, the fine military historian of the Civil War, Gordon Ray, will be here to discuss and sign the final book in his monumental series of books about Grant's overland campaign. This is called On to Petersburg. On to Petersburg is a book that covers the end of the Cold Harbor battles and takes you right into the beginning of the Petersburg campaign. So much going on Author's Voice, on all of our programs. So check out our website, sign up for our email list, find us on social media, follow our authors on social media, and come back again soon. There will be books available after the program. We're going to have signed books if you're watching this on the archive, for instance, if you're watching this on the archive. And let's thank Karen Cox.
Thank you so much
for coming to us and to discuss Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South. Thank you to the staff of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, including, again, our technical director, Matt Blanton, who has flown solo in this particular program. And come back again soon for Author's Voice.